Go. Welcome back, scholars. In a previous video, we talked about while loops. They weren't too difficult. Now let's kind of step it up a little bit and talk about for loops. They're also not that difficult, but they certainly are a little bit more challenging in terms of what you need to input and how you set it up. What we'll talk about a general structure, and you could pretty much follow the structure almost like 90% plus of the times for your introductory CS journey. So that's the structure we'll talk about now. First, let's talk about what for loops are. Like a while loop, for loops allow us to repeat code. However, for loops are written in a slightly different way and have a slightly different purpose. The header of the for loop has three distinct yet connected parts. The three parts, I'll write it out here. So three parts are: one, the variable initialization. Let me actually type this out because my handwriting is not too neat. So let me type this out. So first one we have is the variable initialization. The second one we have is the conditional expression. And the third part is the increment or decrement. It doesn't have to be necessarily an increment or decrement, but I'll just write it like this for now because most likely it will be in a lot of examples. Okay. All right. These three parts are necessary to complete your for loop header. Let's talk about an example just to make this more concrete. So let's say that we had a for loop. And let's say we wanted a for loop that starts at the number 1 and it prints all the way to the number 10 in separate lines. So the output should look like this on separate lines. So the output should look like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth, all the way to 10, one after the other. So the way you do this is, first we have our variable initialization. So we create a variable int, and let's say let's call that num, and let's set that equal to 1. That's our initial value. So we created a variable and we initialized it. This is not, you don't have to do this. You can create it. For example, you can create int num up here and then do num is equal to 1, but like that's not typically what's done. Typically you just create it here. But again, there's flexibility. Just know that it exists. And as you do more practice, it'll become more and more obvious. So next you have a semicolon, very, very important, not a comma. Some people get confused with this as a semicolon. So it's like, this is a complete statement and a semicolon. Kind of thinking about it like that. Kind of. Then we have num. This is your conditional expression. And this condition talks about when we have to stop, essentially. This is like the boundary case, if you will, when you have to stop. So num is less than or equal to 10. Now, num is obviously going to be less than or equal to 10, right? Num is 1. So if num is always 1, then this for loop is going to keep on going forever and ever. So it's an infinite loop. Well, that's not true because we aren't completed. We aren't done yet with our for loop. There's one more thing we have to do. So this is your second step, which is a conditional expression. Next, you have to also include your increment or decrementer, or just a way to change your variable up. In this case, it's an incrementer because we need to go up by 1 each time. So it's num plus plus. Now, what this does is essentially we have num equals 1. It starts at 1, and then you add 1 to, well, not yet. You don't add 1 yet. What you do is you start at 1. You go through the for loop, right? Whatever you have to do, you do it. And then what you do is once you hit the end of the for loop, you go back and you add 1 to num. So num becomes 2. And then you could go through the for loop one more time. And that keeps on going until you reach 10. And when you reach 10, num equals 10. 10 is less than or equal to 10. So we go again one more time. And then once we increment it one more time, it'll become 11. 11 is not less than or equal to 10. And so we are done. We're not gonna go through it one more time. That's essentially what's happening here. It's very intuitive, and if you get it, first of all, it's pretty intuitive. So I guess it's not intuitive, but once you get it, it'll become very easy. Now, one thing that you have to keep in mind is you don't include a semicolon at the end. This is not there. It's only for these first two, and then what you do is just close it up. So no semicolon after that. And then you have your open curly brace and close curly brace. And then inside of this is your code. And obviously here we have our code to print it out. So it shouldn't be too hard. It's just system.out. Now I want it on separate lines. So it's going to be println. You can go ahead and watch our videos on print statements. So println, and then we have num. This is going to work like I said, it's going to output all the way to from 1 to 10. You can try to draw it out on your write the output on your paper. That's the best way to trace your loop. I would encourage you to do that for loops and for while loops. So that was kind of a boring example, but let's jump over to Arnesh and the IDE, he's going to give us a fun example to work with to brighten your mood.
All right, so now we'll be going over for loops. One important thing that I want to point out about for loops is when you use for loops, you use it because you probably know how many times you want the loop to run. Because the important thing is that you're specifying initialization, how many times it's going to run into, and how many times you want to increment it. So for loops, we know how much times you want to iterate or repeat. And so the example I'm going to pull up is related to CS50. So we're going to first create a variable int age of CS50. But one thing I want to point out is, as Pranav mentioned earlier, we usually initialize our variables in the for loop itself. So instead of int, let's first say for, which means iterate a certain amount of time, just like a while loop. So first we initialize it. So we say int age of CS50. Let's now initialize it at 0. Unfortunately, but first, slowly, we're going to keep repeating until it's reached amount we're satisfied with. So now we're going to set the termination condition. So when is this loop going to stop? We're going to say age of CS50 goes until less than or equal to 50. And I wonder why we're using 50 in this case. Well, because CS50 has 50 in it. All right, and now we need the increment decrement operator. So now what we do here is age of CS50 plus plus. And therefore, that is our completed for loop. And we need to make sure we end the parentheses and not a semicolon. And so after that, we have curly braces. And now let's print out age of CS50. But let's now make it more interesting by concatenating strings. So let's say print line, and in quotation marks, we say, if you want to learn more about concatenating strings, you can check out our concatenating strings video that we covered. So let's now say CS50 has grown for CS50, or yeah, CS50 has grown for, and now we can concatenate this specific string to the variable age of CS50. So plus age of CS50. But now if you end it as semicolon, one thing it doesn't make sense, CS50 has grown for 50. So we need to make sure we also add years. So now let's add another plus. So plus years, and make sure we give a space before the years so that it looks more clear in format. And now let's run it. So let's run our code. And essentially we should print out CS50 is going for starting at 0 years, and it goes all the way till it reaches 50 years. So now let's run our program and see what the output is. Almost there. Oh, wow, that's a very interesting format. Let's try to get rid of that space because I think what our IDE is just considered a space. But now let's rerun it. We got rid of the spaces. Hopefully it should look clear in format now. All right, now it looks pretty clear in format. So now let's scroll up and let's just kind of skim through what is the output. So first of all, it's saying 0 years, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, and so on and so forth. Now let's scroll down and see where it stops. We'll see it stops at 50 years. Whoa, that's a coincidence. CS50 is going for 50 years. Isn't that crazy? Well, now let's look over this for loop. All right, so first we start at int age CS50 is 0. That's our initializing statement, basically where we're starting the for loop at. age of CS50 less than or equal to 50, which means how many times do we want this for loop to iterate till? So in this case, we're iterating till 50. So and then the age of CS50 plus plus essentially is the increment. So we're going to keep adding by 1. And each time it's going to add by 1, it's going to print out CS50 is going for age of CS50 here. So first 0, and increments age of CS50 by 1. 1, and then it also prints out 1. In the system output line, prints out 1, and then so on and so forth. So it's going to print out 1, 2, 3, 4 until we reach the end or the termination condition, which is 50 in this case. So that's why it is essential that we include those 3 parts. So to review the 3 important parts of a for loop: number 1, initialization statement; number 2, termination condition. So let's now put that in comment. So initialization statement. Number 2. So number 2 is the termination condition, which is the same thing as saying when should this loop stop, essentially. So termination condition. When shall this loop stop? Or when should this? Yeah, you could just use that. All right, and the last but not least part is the increment operator. So essentially, we can also decrement, we can also increment, but in this case, we can increment because we, of course, do not want to decrement the amount of years in CS50. CS50 is something that will keep growing. You know what I'm saying? All right, so those were the 3 important parts. That's basically how a for loop works. And that's pretty much how for loops work. And thanks for watching the video.